Ancient Egypt might be different than you think. The Great Pyramid of Giza, a mountain of stone standing on the desert plateau, was not built by slaves. There were no whips, no chains, no faceless masses toiling in misery. Instead, there was a city of skilled workers, masons, carpenters, and quarrymen who lived with their families, were paid in bread and beer, and had access to medical care. They took such pride in their work, they left graffiti on the hidden stones, calling their teams the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. This single fact changes everything. It reveals a deeper truth about this ancient world. We often see this as a civilization obsessed with death. The mummies, the dark tombs, the solemn gods of the underworld. But the reality is that they were obsessed with life, so deeply in love with their existence. The warmth of the sun, the taste of food, the bonds of family, that they refused to let it end. Every tomb was a home for eternity. Every mummy, a vessel for a soul's return. And every spell, a promise that life's journey would continue forever. Tonight, we will explore that profound love of life, the true heart of ancient Egypt. So, let us begin where all life in Egypt begins, with the sunrise. Imagine the first light of dawn spilling over the eastern cliffs, turning the Nile from silver to gold. A gentle coolness still hangs in the air before the full heat of the day arrives. Inside a home made of sun-dried mud brick, a family begins to stir. The walls, thick and sturdy, have kept the house cool through the night, a welcome shelter from the elements. And here, in the quiet moments of waking, we find our next surprising truth. The first thing you might notice is the makeup. It is worn by men and women alike. A dark, thick line of black coal is carefully applied around the eyes. We see this as a statement of fashion, an iconic look of ancient beauty. And it was. But it was also something more. The coal was practical. In a land of relentless sun, the dark pigment cut down on the brilliant glare. Much like a modern athlete might wear black grease paint under their eyes, but, more importantly, it was magical. The Egyptians believed the eyes were the windows to the soul, and that the protective ring of coal was a powerful amulet against the evil eye and airborne illnesses. It was not vanity. It was a daily ritual of protection, a shield for the soul. Cleanliness was paramount. To be clean was to be pure, and to be pure was to be closer to the gods. Most homes had a designated area for washing, using water carried from the river and a form of natural soap made from animal fats and chalk. The day began with a ritual of cleansing, a preparation for the work ahead. And the work of Egypt was the work of the Nile. For the farmer, the day was dictated by the season of the great river. During the planting season, he would walk through his fields, the cool, rich mud pressing between his toes as he cast seeds of wheat and barley. He would guide water from the canals, a lifeblood for his crops, using the simple, ingenious shaduf, a long pole with a weight on one end and a bucket on the other. Its rhythmic creak a constant sound along the riverbanks. For the scribe, work was a matter of quiet focus. He was one of the educated few, a respected pillar of the community. He would sit cross-legged, unrolling a fresh sheet of papyrus. On his stone palette he would have 2 cakes of ink, one of black soot and one of red ochre. With a reed brush, he would make his graceful, flowing marks, recording a harvest, writing a letter, or copying a sacred text. The soft scratch of his brush on the papyrus was the sound of civilization itself being recorded. And for the artisan, the stonemason, the painter, the carpenter who built the magnificent tombs, the day was spent in creation. In a village like Deir el Medina, home to the craftsmen who decorated the Valley of the Kings, the air would be filled with the gentle tap-tap-tap of hammer on chisel. These were not slaves, but masters of their craft. They were paid a salary, their wages measured in loaves of bread and jugs of beer, a currency of sustenance that valued their incredible skill. But an Egyptian's day did not end with work. As the sun began to dip towards the western horizon, the land of the afterlife, the people returned to their homes and their families. The evening meal was the center of family life. They would eat bread, of course, the staple of their diet, along with onions, garlic, fish from the river, and sweet fruits like dates and figs. And they knew how to enjoy themselves. We imagine them as solemn and serious, but they loved music, parties, and games. On a warm evening, the sound of a harp, a lute, or a flute might drift from a courtyard. They would tell stories and share laughter. One of their favorite pastimes was a board game called Senet. It was a game of strategy, its pieces moving across a board of 30 squares. It was a way to relax and spend time with loved ones. A gentle competition at the end of a long day. But like everything in Egypt, it had a deeper meaning. The game was also a metaphor for the journey of the soul through the underworld. Each move represented a step closer to the final judgment and the paradise of the afterlife. So, even in their leisure, in a simple board game, they were rehearsing their greatest hope, that life, with all its simple pleasures, would never truly end. As darkness fell, blanketing the valley in a profound silence broken only by the chirping of insects, the Egyptian did not fear the night. It was simply a temporary state, a waiting period, before the sun god Ra would be reborn once more at dawn, beginning the cycle all over again. As the last light of the sun vanished from the sky, the world of the ancient Egyptians did not simply fall into darkness, it transformed. The heavens above became a map of divinity, a silent, swirling testament to the forces that governed their world. And this brings us to another common misunderstanding. We see a bewildering pantheon of gods with the heads of animals, falcons, jackals, lions, and crocodiles. And we might perceive it as strange, perhaps even primitive. But to the Egyptians, this was the most logical and profound way to understand the divine. They did not worship animals. Instead, they recognized that certain animals embodied the pure, undiluted essence of a divine trait. What better way to represent the concept of majestic vision, of a god who could see all from above, than the keen-eyed falcon? This was Horus, the god of the sky and of kingship. What better form for a guardian of the dead, a loyal guide through the darkness, than the ever-watchful jackal? This was Anubis. And what could better capture the fierce, protective power of a mother than the lioness, the most formidable hunter on the Nile? This was Sekhmet. The animal form was not a mask, but a symbol of a god's truest nature. It was a sacred language, a way of seeing the divine not as something separate from their world, but as an integral part of the natural life that flourished and struggled all around them. To understand their world, the Egyptians first had to understand how it began. In the time before time, there was only Nun, a vast, silent, endless ocean of dark, inert water. It was the abyss of chaos, holding everything that was and everything that could be, but in a state of formless potential. There was no up or down, no light or dark, no life or death. Then, out of the silent waters, a thought emerged, a consciousness. And with that consciousness, the first land rose from the primordial ocean. A single, solitary mound of earth, just as a new mound of rich silt would appear each year after the Nile's flood receded. This first mound was the Benben, the birthplace of all. Upon this mound stood the first god, Atum. He was alone in the universe. Through his own will, he brought forth the first divine pair. He created Shu, the god of the air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Imagine the first breath of wind and the first drop of dew in a silent universe. This was their creation. Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, then gave birth to the next pair, Geb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. In the beginning, they were locked in a tight embrace. But their father, Shu, the god of air, stepped between them, gently pushing Nut upwards. And so the world as we know it was formed. Geb became the warm body of the earth beneath our feet, while Nut became the beautiful, star-covered arc of the heavens above us. Her body protecting the world from the chaos of the outer darkness. You can still see her today, her feet on the eastern horizon and her hands on the western, a constant, protective presence. From this union of earth and sky, the next generation of gods was born, the figures who would star in Egypt's most important story. They were two brothers, Osiris and Set, and two sisters, Isis and Nephthys. Osiris became the first king on earth. He was a benevolent ruler, a bringer of civilization. He taught humanity how to cultivate wheat and barley, how to make bread and beer. He gave them laws and taught them how to honor the gods. Under his rule, the world was a paradise of order and prosperity. He was the embodiment of Ma'at. But his brother, Set, grew jealous. Set was the lord of the Red Land, the harsh and sterile desert. He represented chaos, storms, and the untamable violence of nature. He despised the perfect order his brother had created. Through trickery, Set managed to capture Osiris, enclosing him in a magnificent chest and casting it into the Nile. The loss of Osiris was a catastrophe. The land fell into sorrow. But Isis, Osiris's devoted wife and a powerful magician in her own right, refused to despair. Her quest to find her husband is a story of unwavering love and determination. She searched the length of the Nile, following the chest until she finally found it. Using her powerful magic, and with the help of her sister Nephthys, she was able to breathe life back into Osiris just for a short time. In this moment, she conceived their child, a son who would be named Horus. Osiris, however, could no longer rule in the land of the living. His journey through death and back had transformed him. He became the king of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, a realm not of punishment, but of transition and rebirth. He became the judge of the dead and the symbol of resurrection. This story was the very heart of Egyptian belief. It explained the cycle of life, death, and rebirth that they saw everywhere. in the receding and returning flood of the Nile, and in the green shoots that grew from the soil after the harvest. It promised them that death was not the end, but merely a doorway to another eternal existence. And so the gods were not distant figures to be worshipped only in grand temples. They were woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Every single morning, they saw the sun. God Ra being born in the east, they imagined him sailing across the great ocean of the sky in his magnificent solar boat. At midday, he was at his most powerful, nourishing the land. As evening approached, he would sail towards the western horizon, where the sky goddess Nut would swallow him. Throughout the night, Ra's journey continued through the underworld, a place of great danger. He had to face the forces of chaos, most notably the great serpent Apep, who tried to swallow the sun and plunge the world into eternal darkness. But with the help of other gods, including the cunning Set, Ra would defeat the serpent every night and be triumphantly reborn at dawn. This daily cycle of victory over chaos was a source of immense comfort and stability. There was Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, music, and joy, often depicted as a cow or a woman with cow's horns. Her temples were places of celebration, filled with the sounds of rattling sistrums and joyful song. There was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and knowledge. He was the patron of the scribes, the one who was said to have invented the hieroglyphs. It was to Thoth that a scribe would offer a prayer before beginning his work. And in the quiet corners of every home, there were the small, personal gods who offered direct protection. There was Bes, a cheerful and fierce dwarf god, whose image was thought to ward off snakes, scorpions, and evil spirits. And there was Taweret, the goddess of childbirth, depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus, a powerful and protective figure who watched over mothers and their newborn children. These were not gods of a distant heaven, but members of the household, guardians of the family. They show, once again, that the core of Egyptian belief was centered on the protection and continuation of life, in all its precious and ordinary forms. The cycle of sunrise and sunset, of the Nile's flood and retreat, governed the Egyptian world. But there was one transition that every person, from the simplest farmer to the most powerful pharaoh, had to prepare for: the journey from this life to the next. And here we encounter the greatest misconception of all, that this was a culture consumed by a morbid fear of death. The opposite is true. Their preparations were not born of fear, but of an unshakable confidence in eternity. What we are about to explore is not a descent into darkness, but the beginning of a meticulously planned, sacred journey towards the light. When a person's time in this world came to an end, the Egyptians did not believe their life was over. They believed the soul simply separated from the body to begin its great voyage. They envisioned the soul as having several parts, but two were essential: the Ka, which was the vital life force, and the Ba, which was the individual personality, often depicted as a beautiful bird with a human head. At the moment of death, the Ba would fly free from the body, but it would need to return each night to rest and be nourished. For this to happen, the physical body had to be preserved, transformed from a vessel of flesh into an eternal home for the soul. This began the sacred science of mummification. It was a ritual that could take up to 70 days, performed not by doctors but by skilled priests in a special workshop called the Wabete, the place of purification. The process was a mystery they perfected over centuries. The first step was to remove the internal organs, which would otherwise cause the body to decay. This was done with reverence. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were carefully preserved, anointed with sacred oils, and placed into 4 special containers called canopic jars. Each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of the god Horus, who would guard these essential parts for eternity. The heart, however, was always left in place. To the Egyptians, the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and memory, the very essence of a person. It would be needed for the final judgment. In a step that shows their unique understanding of the body, the brain was removed through the nose with long, hooked instruments. They did not consider it to be an important organ, and so it was discarded. The body was then ready for its transformation. It was washed with palm wine and spices, and then covered completely in a mountain of natron, a natural salt harvested from the dry lake beds of the desert. For 40 days, the body would rest in the salt, as the natron drew out every last bit of moisture, purifying and preserving the flesh. It was a long, silent vigil, a time of quiet transformation. When the 40 days were complete, the wrapping would begin. This was not a hurried task, but a slow, intricate ritual. Hundreds of yards of the finest linen were used, wrapping each finger and each toe separately before enveloping the limbs and the torso. As the priests worked, their movements were like a hypnotic dance. They would chant spells and prayers, weaving magic into the very fabric of the wrappings. Between the layers of linen, they would place powerful protective amulets. The Ankh, the symbol of life. The Jed pillar, representing stability. The powerful Eye of Horus, to ward off evil. And most importantly, over the heart, they would place a scarab beetle amulet, often inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, asking the heart not to speak out against the deceased during the final judgment. Once the wrapping was complete, the mummy was placed in its beautifully decorated coffin, and the final preparations for the tomb could be made. The tomb was not a grave. It was a mansion of eternity. It was a perfect, idealized home, filled with everything the person's soul would need to live a full and comfortable afterlife. There was furniture, clothing, jewelry, and plates of mummified food and jars of wine. There were even game boards like Senet, so the deceased could continue to enjoy their favorite pastimes. Small magical servant statues called shabtis were also placed in the tomb. There would often be 365 of them, one for every day of the year. If the deceased was called upon to perform manual labor in the afterlife, they could send a shabti to do the work in their place, leaving them free to enjoy paradise. Before the tomb was sealed, a final, beautiful ceremony was performed, the opening of the mouth. A high priest would touch the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy with sacred instruments, magically reawakening the senses. Now, the soul could speak, see, and hear again in the afterlife. The body was ready. The eternal home was prepared. The great journey could now begin. For the soul, the next stage was a perilous voyage through the underworld, the Duat. To navigate it, the deceased was equipped with a personal guide, a collection of spells and passwords written on a papyrus scroll, which we now call the Book of the Dead. It was a map, an instruction manual, and a celestial GPS for the soul. The journey would lead the soul to the Hall of Two Truths, for the ultimate test, the weighing of the heart. Imagine a vast, silent hall, presided over by the god Osiris, seated on his golden throne. The soul would be led forward by the jackal-headed Anubis. In the center of the hall stood a great set of golden scales. On one side of the scale, Anubis would place the heart of the deceased. On the other, he would place a single pure white ostrich feather, the feather of Ma'at, representing truth, order, and justice. The ibis-headed Thoth stood ready with his palette to record the verdict. Waiting nearby was the fearsome creature Ammit, the devourer of souls, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. If the heart was heavy with misdeeds, it would be thrown to Ammit, and the soul would cease to exist. But the goal was not to punish. It was to prove one's worth. The deceased would address the gods and recite the negative confession, declaring all the things they had not done in life. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused pain. Then all eyes would turn to the scales. If the person had lived a good and balanced life, their heart would be as light as the feather. The scale would remain even. At this moment, a great sense of peace would fill the hall. Thoth would declare the soul true of voice, and Osiris would welcome them into the eternal afterlife. And what was that afterlife? It was not a distant, cloudy heaven. It was a paradise called the Field of Reeds. It was a perfect, idealized version of the Egypt they had known and loved. A land where the sun always shone. The crops were always bountiful, and the Nile flowed peacefully forever. A place with no sickness, no sadness, and no hardship, where they could rejoin their family and friends and live in blissful contentment among the gods for all eternity. The Field of Reeds was the destination, the eternal paradise promised to the worthy. For nearly 3,000 years, this belief was the bedrock of Egyptian civilization. But no earthly kingdom, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. The new kingdom, with its great warrior pharaohs and immense wealth, eventually gave way to a slow, inevitable decline. A succession of foreign powers would come to drink from the Nile: Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, and finally, the Greeks under Alexander the Great. His general, Ptolemy, would establish one final dynasty of Greek-speaking pharaohs, ending with the brilliant Queen Cleopatra. When she died, and the Roman eagle standard was raised over Alexandria, the age of the pharaohs was officially over. Slowly, the old ways began to fade. The new religions of Christianity and later Islam swept through the land. The grand temples of Karnak and Philae fell silent. The last priests who knew the ancient rituals passed away, and with them, one of Egypt's greatest secrets was lost: the knowledge of how to read the sacred hieroglyphs. For more than 1,400 years, the voices of the ancient Egyptians were silenced. Their incredible history, their poetry, their letters, their spells, all became beautiful but incomprehensible pictures on stone. The civilization fell asleep, but the world did not forget Egypt. The silent, colossal pyramids and the enigmatic gaze of the Sphinx remained, whispering of a lost, magnificent past. And in the late 18th century, the world came rushing back. The French general, Napoleon Bonaparte, invaded Egypt, and he brought with him not just soldiers, but an army of scholars, scientists, and artists. They measured the temples, copied the inscriptions, and studied the flora and fauna. Their work ignited a fire of Egyptomania, across Europe. Everyone wanted a piece of this mysterious ancient land. And then, a discovery was made that would change everything. In 1799, a group of French soldiers rebuilding a fort in the delta town of Rosetta found a broken slab of black stone. It wasn't beautiful, but it was the most important discovery in the history of Egyptology. The stone was inscribed with the same decree in 3 different scripts: the sacred hieroglyphs at the top, a common Egyptian script called Demotic in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom. This was the key: the Rosetta Stone. For the first time, scholars had a way to translate the lost language of the pharaohs. The intellectual race to crack the code began. For 20 years, the greatest minds in Europe struggled with the puzzle. The final breakthrough came from a brilliant young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion. He realized that the hieroglyphs were not just simple picture writing. They were a complex and beautiful mix of alphabetic signs, syllabic signs, and symbols that represented whole ideas. In 1822, after years of obsessive work, he finally deciphered the names of the pharaohs in the cartouches, and the secret was unlocked. He is said to have run into his brother's office, cried, "I've got it!" and promptly fainted from exhaustion. The voices of Egypt could speak again. The silence was broken. And as we began to listen, we realized their voices were not as distant as we thought. The legacy of ancient Egypt is not confined to museums or the sands of the desert. It is woven into the very fabric of our modern world in ways that are both surprising and profound. Think of the calendar that hangs on your wall. The idea of a year with 365 days divided into 12 months is a direct inheritance from the ancient Egyptians. They developed this accurate solar calendar to predict the annual flooding of the Nile, the event upon which their entire civilization depended. The Romans later adapted it, and it is the basis of the calendar we use to this day. Think of the paper on which books are printed. The very word paper comes from papyrus. The miraculous river reed the Egyptians turned into the world's first practical writing material. It was light, portable, and easy to store, and it revolutionized the recording and sharing of information. Their achievements in medicine were astonishing. From the practice of mummification, they gained a detailed knowledge of human anatomy. Their medical papyri contained diagnoses and treatments for a wide range of ailments, and they describe surprisingly complex surgical procedures. And of course, their monumental architecture has inspired builders for millennia. The column, the pillar, the grand temple entrance. These are concepts that were passed on to the Greeks and Romans, and which still influence the design of our most important buildings. So, the civilization that seemed so ancient, so remote, is closer than we think. Their quest for eternity, their profound love of life, was, in a way, successful. They are not gone. Their monuments still stand, defying the ages. Their stories are still told, and their contributions to human knowledge still echo in our daily lives. In the Great Chronicle of Egypt, some pharaohs carved their names into mountains and ruled for decades, leaving behind legacies of conquest and colossal temples. But one king, who ruled for only a decade and died before he was 20, would become the most famous of them all. His name was Tutankhamun. In his own time, he was a minor figure, a boy king who ascended to the throne in a time of turmoil. His primary role was to restore the old gods and traditions that his father the heretic King Akhenaten had cast aside. He moved the capital back to Thebes, reopened the temples, and brought stability back to the land. But he died young and was buried in a surprisingly small tomb, perhaps hastily prepared, in the Valley of the Kings. And then he was forgotten. Later kings built over his tomb. His name was struck from some records, and for 3,000 years, his story dissolved into the silent dust of the valley. The Valley of the Kings itself is a place of secrets. A sun-baked, desolate canyon on the west bank of the Nile. Its golden cliffs hold the hidden tombs of Egypt's greatest rulers. By the early 20th century, archaeologists believed all its secrets had been revealed. Every known pharaoh's tomb had been accounted for, and though all of them had been plundered in antiquity, they had given us a deep understanding of New Kingdom burial practices. The book, it seemed, was closed. But one man refused to believe it. A stubborn and deeply patient English archaeologist named Howard Carter was convinced that one tomb, however small, was still missing: the tomb of the boy king, Tutankhamun. For years, his wealthy patron, Lord Carnarvon, funded his search. And for years, Carter found almost nothing. Imagine the scene, season after season, under the relentless Egyptian sun. Carter oversaw a team of workers who systematically cleared the valley floor, moving tens of thousands of tons of ancient rubble, basket by basket. The heat was immense. The dust was suffocating. Other archaeologists scoffed, believing he was wasting his time and money. By 1922, after 5 fruitless seasons, Lord Carnarvon had had enough. He summoned Carter to England and told him the search was over. But Carter, with his unshakable belief, begged for one final season. He would even pay for it himself if he had to. Carnarvon, moved by his dedication, agreed. One last chance. Carter decided to excavate a small, triangular patch of ground that had been overlooked, an area covered by the remains of ancient workers' huts from the time of Ramesses the Great. It was his final gamble. On the 4th of November, 1922, the digging began. And within hours, a worker's tool struck something hard. It was not bedrock. It was a step, cut into the stone. Slowly, carefully, the team began to clear the rubble. A second step appeared, then a third. Soon, an entire staircase of 16 steps was revealed, descending into the earth. At the bottom was a sealed doorway, covered in plaster. And on the plaster were the faint impressions of the royal necropolis seals, the mark of a jackal over 9 bound captives. It was the seal of a royal tomb. Carter's heart must have been pounding, but he was a meticulous archaeologist. He had the staircase photographed and documented. He then refilled the entire staircase with sand to protect it, and sent a now famous telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England. It read, "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered, same for your arrival. Congratulations." It took 2.5 weeks for Carnarvon to arrive. Imagine the agonizing wait for Howard Carter. When his patron finally stood beside him, they cleared the staircase once more and stood before the sealed door. With trembling hands, Carter made a small opening in the top left corner of the doorway. He lit a candle to test for foul gases, and then, holding it up, he peered into the darkness. The hot air escaping from the tomb caused the candle flame to flicker. For a moment, His eyes, accustomed to the bright sunlight, could see nothing. But as they adjusted, details of the room within slowly emerged from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. Lord Carnarvon, standing anxiously behind him, could bear the silence no longer. "Can you see anything?" he asked. Carter, his voice filled with awe, could barely speak the words. "Yes," he said. "Wonderful things." And they were. As they widened the opening and entered the antechamber, they were met with a sight that no one had seen in over 3,300 years. It was an unbelievable collection of treasures, piled almost to the ceiling. There were 3 great gilded couches, carved in the shapes of lions and cows. There were intricate painted chests containing royal robes and jewelry. There were graceful alabaster vases and disassembled golden chariots. And guarding the far wall stood 2 life-sized statues of the king, covered in black resin with golden headdresses and kilts, standing like silent sentinels. It was not the tomb of a great pharaoh, but a small one. And yet, if this was the splendor of a minor king, what must the tombs of giants like Ramesses the Great have held? For weeks and months, Carter and his team meticulously catalogued, photographed, and preserved every one of the thousands of objects. But their greatest discovery still lay behind the wall, guarded by the 2 statues. There, they found another sealed doorway. When they opened it, they found themselves in the burial chamber. The room was almost completely filled by a single immense object, a massive shrine of gilded wood. It was like a golden box, larger than a modern car. When they opened its doors, they found another, slightly smaller shrine inside. And inside that one, another. And inside that one, a 4th. Finally, within the last shrine, they found what they were looking for. The king's sarcophagus, carved from a single block of yellow quartzite. With immense effort, they raised the heavy granite lid. Inside, they did not find the mummy, but yet another coffin. This one carved in the shape of the king as the god Osiris. It was covered in gold leaf. When they opened this coffin, they found a second one, even more magnificent. And when they opened the second, they were met with a sight that left them speechless. The third and final coffin was made of 243 pounds of solid beaten gold. It is perhaps the single most beautiful and valuable ancient artifact ever discovered. When they carefully lifted its lid, they at last saw the face of the king. There lay the royal mummy of Tutankhamun, and covering his head and shoulders was the magnificent golden death mask. With its stripes of deep blue lapis lazuli, its serene expression, and the protective vulture and cobra on its brow, it is the ultimate symbol of ancient Egypt. It was the face of a young man, a boy, who had been lost to history, but was now found. His treasures did not just reveal wealth, they opened a perfect, unblemished window into the past and brought the true splendor of the pharaoh's eternal dream to life for all the world to see.